Business Hour with Olibogeng on OFM, the sound of your life.
You dialed into the OFM Business Hour on the sound of your life with me, Olibogeng Motse. The OFM Business Hour is powered by Standard Bank Business Banking. Now, I'm sure you've noticed emails or messages from a whole host of companies urging you to opt out if you no longer wanted to receive further emails from those companies. This was in light of the commencement date of the outstanding section of the Protection of Personal Information Act, aka POPI. Are these emails necessary? And do you as a small business need to do the same? What about those WhatsApp group messages? Well, tonight, Nicole Gabryk from ENS Africa will answer all those questions. Here's part one of my chat with her. Group administrators on WhatsApp, for example, sending out these little disclaimer things. And my question is, are those necessary, number one, as per the POPI Act? Because that's what those little disclaimers are implying. And number two, doesn't WhatsApp via Facebook apply for prior authorization on their end and then everything's sorted?
In short, no, it's not necessary to have these consents. Okay, so the first thing people need to remember is that consent is not the only basis for processing personal information. So we have a number of reasons in terms of which people can process personal information, and our general personal information, for example, your name, your ID number, your telephone number, for example, those sorts of identifiers, you don't necessarily need consent to process that information. So you do need a lawful reason to process it, but you don't necessarily need consent. Then we touch on special personal information. So these are our red flag items, things like your race, your trade union membership, biometric information, and that kind of information. You then generally need consent. But for WhatsApp, and it's not limited to WhatsApp, for any messenger platform services, you don't need consent to continue with those groups. Right. What I do suggest and recommend that people do is recreate groups and send invitations to people to be in those groups, so that by doing so, people understand exactly what those groups are about. And you can then restructure your groups to make sure you've got only the right sorts of people. And that users on their own WhatsApp settings change their privacy settings on WhatsApp. So that, for example, their photographs and telephone numbers aren't necessarily displayed on those groups.
Nicole, but say, for example, there is kind of this movement with social media groups where businesses are actually using them to make transactions or to engage with their customers. Once that kind of thing happens, does that change the terms of our agreement as a customer and a business owner?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
It's just the platform in terms of which you choose to communicate is entirely up to you, and that isn't really what's in question there. So WhatsApp obviously has end-to-end encryption, and it's protected from that perspective. And WhatsApp will never be able to access your messages and what's being sent along the lines of those messages. So it's not dissimilar from using email services or different platforms, but obviously email servers and those sorts of things are just more secure platforms to use, and they're recommended that we use those kinds of platforms. But for smaller businesses that use WhatsApp, they should continue to do so, but just to consider what sort of content is shared on those platforms and how those groups, for example, are set up and administrated.
And that was part one of my conversation with Nicole Gabryk from ENS Africa. She explains that consent is not the only basis for processing personal information, and as such, you do not need consent for processing general personal information like your name, telephone, ID number, etc. So long as you have a lawful reason, you're good to go. Special information or special personal information like biometrics and race, etc. are a different ballgame. She stresses there is also no need for WhatsApp group administrators to send those consent messages that we've been seeing. However, she does recommend that groups be recreated to ensure that members are aware of the purpose of the group and thus have an option to edit private settings accordingly. Now, part two of my chat with her is coming up next on The Sound of Your Life.
The Business Hour with Olibogeng on OFM, the sound of your life.
Welcome back to your daily dose of the OFM Business Hour, powered by Standard Bank Business Banking. Tonight I'm speaking to ENS Executive in the Dispute Resolution Department, Nicole Gabryk, regarding the Poppy Act and social media. Here's part 2 of our conversation. We interviewed a doctor and she was telling us about how her website now has to have certain documentation uploaded because that's where she talks about her practice and stuff like that. So in what ways does the Poppy Act then apply to a medical practitioner and then to their medical practice?
So it wouldn't really matter if you were a doctor or you were anyone else. The only difference or perhaps special instance we need to consider for medical practitioners is that they're likely to touch on a lot of special personal information, so health data, for example. So one of the requirements of Poppy, our sixth processing condition, is the requirement of openness. And what that requires of us is that we have to be open with our data subject. We have to be transparent with our data subject about what we do with their personal information. And that is generally in practice done by way of what's called a privacy policy or a privacy statement. Though we use interchangeably, they mean the same thing. And that is what we put up on our websites, for example, or we send out to our data subject, or we make it accessible to our data subjects. So that statement fully articulates in a clear and transparent manner what we do and where we use information. So, for example, if I use special personal information for health reasons because I'm a medical doctor, I would need to put that into my privacy policy that patients are able to access that. If, for example, I transfer that information to another third party who provides software services to me, for example, and that's where the information ends up housed on a different server, I would need to tell data subjects about that. So that's where this privacy policy and what we need to tell people and what goes onto our websites comes from.
All right. I guess now for those who perhaps haven't, complied with the act, is it too late? I think that's what most people are wondering. Some people only found out this week, I'm sure.
No, there's many people that only found out this week. There's many people that have been working at it for 10 years.
Yeah.
So we've got a whole variety of people. So I like to say to people, just because the clock is ticked down and we're at the 1st of July doesn't mean you give up and do nothing, okay? It means that in any Poppy compliance, it's always a journey. No one can say that as of today, they're 100% compliant and they're going to be compliant for the next 10 years going forward. Poppy compliance is a verb. It's an active thing. It's a journey. Because every time we do anything with personal information, we have to comply with the 8 processing conditions. So that means that what I do today may be compliant. What I do tomorrow may not be compliant. So anyone that's done nothing towards compliance means that this is as good a time as any to start doing something, because what the regulator would take into account, if, for example, there was a complaint or there was an audit down the line, they would take into account what steps you have taken as against compliance in considering any enforcement action, for example. So there are steps that companies can take. There are steps that SMEs can take, for example, or sole practitioners that are struggling. There are certain mandatory must-haves they should be doing. And if they haven't done it by today, then this is as good a time as any to start that journey to get it done as soon as possible.
Okay. All right. I guess in closing, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that have been swirling around that you've seen on social media, on the news, some things to clarify, I think, in closing?
Yeah, so the first is this WhatsApp group issue. I mean, I think every single one of us got about 10 of these yesterday, and every time I chuckle. But, what is good about that is that people are thinking about privacy, and I think that's an important start. The other thing was this mass campaign of sending out emails to opt out or opt into marketing things. I'm sure you must have received about 50 emails in the last 2 days in your inbox. Now, it presents a twofold issue to me. One, people probably haven't properly considered Section 69, which are the direct marketing provisions of Poppy and what that means. And that's an entire discussion for another day because it's a very lengthy thing. And secondly, phishing attacks are rife. I mean, I think in between 2019 and 2020, they doubled the amount of phishing attacks that have occurred. And now we're having all these emails going out, and it's a hacker's dream world because you've got to be very careful about what source you're clicking on to verify information. So I do think it's going to lead to a lot of phishing attacks and a lot of data breaches in itself is the other thing that we need to be mindful of. And then the third thing is these emails that are sending out privacy policies. So yes, it is good to make your data subjects aware of your privacy policy, but you don't have to have emailed it out. As long as it's accessible and it's on your website, that should be good enough for your purposes. You don't have to go and spam 2,000 people with your privacy policy.
And that was Nicole Gabryk from ENS Africa. She says that one of the requirements of the POPI Act is openness or transparency with data subjects regarding what is done with their personal information. And this is done by way of a privacy statement or policy, which can be found on a website or sent via your emails. I'm sure you've received one of such emails of late. To listen to parts 1 and 2 of my conversations with the ENS executive, head on over to the OFM website. That's ofm.co.za. Click on Read and then on Business.
The Business Hour with Olibogeng on OFM, the sound of your life.